March 1945. A command post near Koblenz, Germany. Mud sticks to the tires of every passing vehicle, and the air smells of wet stone, cold diesel, and burnt wood. Inside a stone room, a defeated man stands at rigid attention, refusing to let his shaking knees buckle. His left sleeve is dark with dried blood, and shrapnel wounds tear his trousers. He expects the worst because his leaders told him to expect the worst. He braces for public humiliation, a cell or perhaps a bullet. He waits for the conquering general to arrive and strip away the final pieces of his military dignity. But what happens next inside this cold room catches everyone off guard. This is what the general did when no one was watching, changing everything this beaten soldier believed about his enemy. This is the story of what happened when a severely injured German commander surrendered to the Third Army and expected nothing but brutality from his captors. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Private First Class Edward Vance was 21 years old, from a small farming community outside Lincoln, Nebraska, serving with the 318th Infantry Regiment of the 80th Infantry Division. Before the draft pulled him into the war, Vance spent his mornings hauling hay and fixing tractors. Knowing nothing of Europe except what he read in the county newspaper, he had lost his older brother at St. Lo, a loss that left him quiet, watchful, and deeply suspicious of the men wearing field gray. He had seen too many good boys from Nebraska buried in shallow dirt, and by the time his unit reached the Rhineland, his heart had hardened against the enemy. On this cold afternoon, Vance was pulling guard duty outside the forward command post, his rifle slick with rain, when the jeep arrived bearing a captured German general who could barely stand. General Major Ernst von Schreiber was 52 years old, born to a long line of Prussian military officers in Potsdam, and currently commanding a shattered division trying to hold the river crossings. He had spent his entire adult life in a tailored wool uniform, decorated with the Iron Cross, and carrying a family lineage that stretched back 4 centuries. Von Schreiber believed in the old ways, the absolute authority of rank, and the strict propaganda broadcasted by his government, which claimed that American troops were unprincipled butchers who executed captured officers without a trial. His uniform was torn, his left arm was bound in a filthy, blood-soaked dressing, and a piece of American artillery shrapnel had carved a jagged path through his right thigh. He had stayed awake for 6 days, drinking stale chicory coffee and watching his regiments burn until his final defensive line dissolved into the mud. Now he stood on American-held soil, expecting nothing less than a firing squad or total public humiliation. By March 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany had broken the spine of the Western defense, turning the campaign into a series of desperate, chaotic holding actions. The American Third Army pressed hard against the Rhine, forcing entire German divisions to split into isolated pockets with zero communication and collapsing logistics. German military leadership had decayed into total disarray, leaving frontline commanders with conflicting orders to hold every patch of mud to the last bullet or face execution by their own state. In the rush to secure bridges and clear the roads toward Frankfurt, many forward units handled surrendered staff officers with a quick, rough search before sending them straight to the rear in open trucks. Many American captains and majors, exhausted by months of unrelenting combat, overlooked standard protocols and let their infantrymen treat high-ranking prisoners with blunt hostility. The stress of the final push made many field commanders ignore the traditional courtesies traditionally granted to captured general officers under international agreements. Soldiers on both sides had grown cold, seeing the conflict not as a contest between professional armies, but as a bitter race to the finish line where survival was the only rule that mattered. Inside the busy forward command posts, the sheer volume of incoming prisoners frequently overwhelmed the small processing teams, leading to short tempers and sharp tongue lashings. Yet, the old codes of military conduct still lingered in the minds of a few men who remembered a time before the total destruction of the European theater. The rain continued to fall over the stone courtyard near Koblenz, washing away the grease and carbon from the heavy transport trucks. The guards at the entrance checked their weapons as the wind rattled the wooden door of the processing room. Captain Thomas Miller, a 34-year-old officer from Columbus, Ohio, assigned to the 3rd Army's Forward Intelligence Section, sat behind a folding wooden table covered in maps. He watched the limping German officer step into the room, noting the blood drying on the gray trousers and the tight, painful grip the man maintained on his shattered left arm. Miller pointed to a heavy oak chair positioned directly across from the desk. "Sit down, General." Von Schreiber stayed exactly where he was, his chin elevated, his boots pressed close together, despite the clear trembling in his right leg. "I prefer to stand." Miller leaned forward, tapping his pencil against a field manual. "You are bleeding through your uniform, and you have been evading our advance for days. Sit down so our medical team can look at that arm." Von Schreiber tightened his jaw, staring straight at the stone wall behind the desk. "I am a general officer of the Defense Force, and I know what your units do to men who surrender their positions." Miller sighed, setting the pencil down on the map. "We are not here to shoot you, General. We need information on the remaining river fortifications, and you need a clean dressing before that arm rots." Von Schreiber sneered, his voice tight with deep-seated defensive pride. "Your propaganda tells the world of your mercy, but your soldiers are uncultured mercenaries who delight in tearing down our military traditions. You wish to see a Prussian nobleman crawl in the mud for your amusement." Miller shook his head, his voice remaining level. "Nobody is asking you to crawl, but you are a prisoner of war under international law, and you are currently obstructing a routine processing order." Von Schreiber narrowed his eyes, his breathing heavy as the pain in his thigh flared. "You are a clerk, Captain, not a combatant. You have no understanding of the sacrifices made at the riverbanks, and I refuse to cooperate with an army that intends to parade me through the streets like a trophy." Miller looked at the German's pale face, realizing the man's exhaustion had pushed him past the point of reason. "This conversation is over, General. I am notifying the command element that you are refusing medical treatment and basic processing." Von Schreiber did not break his stance. "Tell your superiors that a true soldier does not bow to butchers." Miller stood up from his chair, bypassed the prisoner without another word, and picked up the field telephone hanging on the wall. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The heavy wooden door swung open, and the general walked in unannounced. Every man in the room snapped to attention, the rustle of papers instantly freezing into absolute silence. Patton did not raise his voice. He walked directly to the center of the room, his eyes locking onto the pale, sweating German officer, who still refused to lean against the wall. Patton studied him. He took in the crusting blood on the gray wool sleeve, the tremor in the right leg, and the defiant angle of the man's chin. "Who commanded the defense at the river crossing?" Von Schreiber cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly. "I did, General." "How many days did you hold that bridgehead?" "We held it for 2 full days against your armored spearheads." "Did your men fight according to the orders given by your high command?" "They did, General. We fought to the last operational round as professional soldiers." Patton took a step closer, his voice quiet, but it carried to every corner of the stone room. "You fought well. Your defense of the river crossing cost me 2 days and more men than I would care to count. You are a soldier, and you have performed your duty under the rules of our shared profession. You stand here expecting us to behave like the monsters described in your state broadcasts because that is the reality you have been trained to accept. You believe that victory gives a commander the right to degrade an opponent who has run out of ammunition. Look at your own uniform. It is torn, your blood is soaking through the wool, and your legs are shaking from sheer physical exhaustion. An American infantryman from Nebraska is standing guard outside this door because he was ordered to hold the line, just as your men were ordered to hold the river. You have a choice. Sit down in that chair right now and let our medical staff treat your wounds, or continue standing until you collapse onto this stone floor. Either way, The fighting for your division is over, and you will be handled with the proper respect that the military profession demands from its officers." Von Schreiber stared at the American commander, the rigid defiance in his shoulders slowly dissolving as his head dropped. He reached out with his uninjured hand, gripped the back of the oak chair, and sat down. Patton turned to his personal aide and signaled toward the hallway where the medical orderly waited with a canvas bag of fresh dressings. The medic stepped into the stone room, unrolling a clean white bandage and handing the general a tin cup filled to the brim with cold well water. Von Schreiber swallowed the water in 3 heavy gulps while the American specialist cut away the stiff, blood-hardened wool from the shrapnel tear in his right thigh. 2 high-ranking American division staff officers stood near the windows, watching in total silence as the captive general received the exact same medical treatment as a wounded frontline private. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the damp air, covering the smell of wet mud and old soot that clung to the stone walls of the command post. Patton watched the procedure without moving, his hands resting on his belt near the ivory grips of his revolvers until the clean white wrap was secured. He then instructed his driver to prepare a covered staff car to transport the German officer to the clean beds of the evacuation hospital. The surrounding guards lowered their weapons, realizing that the standard rules of the professional soldier had completely overwritten the raw hatred of the battlefield. Private First Class Edward Vance returned to Nebraska in the late autumn of 1945. His uniform packed away in a cedar chest, and his mind permanently altered by the events in the stone room. He took over his family's agricultural property outside Lincoln, working the soil for another 40 years, and refusing to speak about the details of his overseas service to anyone except his local veterans group. He passed away quietly in the summer of 1988, leaving behind a small wooden box containing his brother's silver dog tags and a single clean bandage wrapper he had salvaged from the floor near Koblenz. General Major Ernst von Schreiber spent 3 years in a high-security officer encampment near England before receiving an official discharge from Allied custody during the reconstruction efforts. He returned to a ruined family estate in the Western Zone, spending his remaining years teaching mathematics at a regional secondary school and writing private memoirs about the final defense of the river crossing. He died in the winter of 1974, maintained to his last hour that the unexpected chivalry of a single American commander had saved his life and restored his faith in human decency. General Patton never entered the incident into his official wartime logbook, choosing instead to file the intelligence report away in the bottom drawer of his personal field desk. He described the encounter in a late-night journal entry to his wife, writing that treating a defeated enemy with proper dignity costs a commander's absolutely nothing, but reveals the true character of the army representing the Republic. Some historians have argued that Patton's display of professional courtesy toward high-ranking enemy captives was an extension of his own deep obsession with ancient military chivalry and warrior traditions. They suggest that he viewed warfare as a contest between elite classes of officers who were bound by honor codes that superseded the immediate geopolitical conflicts of the era. Others have argued the opposite, stating that such actions were calculated psychological maneuvers designed to speed up the total surrender of enemy units by showing that compliance would not lead to execution. What is certain is that the field hospital records and the subsequent treatment of the captured officer staff at the Koblenz facility completely matched the highest legal standards set by the international conventions governing the rules of land warfare. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have treated the defeated enemy commander with the same harshness he expected? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.